Across ancient civilizations, mythology has always been a powerful way to explain history, destiny, and the divine. From the mighty gods of Greek and Norse mythology to the legendary heroes of Hindu and Egyptian tales, every culture has its epic stories. Today we journey into Chinese mythology, exploring one of the most fascinating figures from the classic tale Investiture of the Gods, Jiang Ziya. He wasn't a warrior, nor was he born a king. Instead, he was a 70-year-old fisherman who would go on to overthrow an empire, reshape the celestial order, and create the legendary Fengshen List. If you love mythology, ancient legends, and hero stories, this is one tale you won't want to miss. In Chinese mythology, the name Jiang Ziya carries legendary weight. He was the mastermind behind the fall of the Shang Dynasty, the chief strategist for the founding of the Zhou Dynasty, and, most importantly, the architect of the Fengshen List, the divine ranking system that decided which spirits became gods. But before all of that, he was an absolute nobody. He spent 40 years trying to become an immortal, and failed. He hit rock bottom at 70, unemployed and fishing by the river. And to top it all off, he used a straight hook with no bait. And yet, fate had bigger plans. This old man who couldn't even catch a fish ended up catching destiny itself and changed the course of history forever. How did a jobless senior citizen go from an outcast to one of the most powerful figures in Chinese mythology? Let's dive into the craziest underdog story in legend. Jiang Ziya wasn't born into royalty or power. He was just an ordinary guy, until fate threw him into the Kunlun Mountains, the elite school of Taoist immortals. Kunlun was basically the Ivy League of Chinese mythology. Every student there was either a supernatural prodigy or a future god. They could control the wind and lightning, ride flying swords, and summon magical beasts. And then, there was Jiang Ziya. While others mastered spells in days, he struggled for decades. His sword-flying practice crashed in the first 5 seconds. His fire spells barely lit a candle. His lightning technique fizzled out like a damp firework. While his peers became celestial warriors and divine generals, Jiang Ziya spent 40 years in Kunlun and achieved absolutely nothing. But he didn't get kicked out. Instead, the immortal masters reassigned him to the kitchen. And so, while the future gods were training in magic and martial arts, Jiang Ziya was chopping vegetables and stirring soup. One day, after decades of failure, his master, Yuan Shitianzun, one of the highest gods in Chinese mythology, summoned him. Jiang Ziya, the old deity, said, "You have no destiny as an immortal. You were never meant to ascend." Jiang Ziya's heart sank. 40 years, he had devoted his entire life to this, and now his teacher was telling him he wasn't good enough. But then came the twist. "But," Yuan Shitianzun continued, "you do have a greater fate in the mortal world. You are destined to assist a great king, topple the corrupt Shang Dynasty, and reshape the balance of heaven and earth." Jiang Ziya froze. Wait, what? He was a failed immortal in training who had spent most of his time cooking, and now he was supposed to overthrow a goddamn empire? Before he could protest, Yuan Shitianzun handed him a dusty book of war strategies, a simple wooden staff, and kicked him down the mountain. Jiang Ziya stumbled down the Kunlun slopes, staring at the vast world below, feeling nothing but dread. He had no power, no army, and no idea what he was doing. The only thing he knew for sure, he was now officially unemployed. After being forcibly retired from the Immortal Academy, Jiang Ziya wandered the mortal world, desperately looking for anything he could do. Turns out, he sucked at everything. He tried selling noodles. Customers spat them out. He became a fortune teller. People laughed when his predictions went horribly wrong. He even attempted blacksmithing, but every sword he made snapped in half after one swing. The man was an absolute failure. So, he gave up. He found a quiet riverbank, sat down, and started fishing. But because he was Jiang Ziya, even his way of fishing was weird. His hook was completely straight. No bait, no barb, no way of catching anything. People mocked him. "Old man, what the hell are you doing? You'll never catch a fish like that." But Jiang Ziya just smiled. "I'm not fishing for fish," he said. "I'm fishing for fate." And for years, that's all he did. Until one day, a powerful ruler rode past that very riverbank. His name was Ji Chang, the Duke of Zhou, future father of the first Zhou king. He was a brilliant strategist and a just ruler, but his state was small, and he was waiting for the right person to help him challenge the Shang Dynasty. And when he saw an old man fishing with a straight hook, something clicked. "This man," Ji Chang murmured, "is different. He walked up to Jiang Ziya and said, "Sir, would you be willing to assist me?" Jiang Ziya looked up. This was it, the fate he had been waiting for. At 70 years old, after a lifetime of failure, rejections, and disappointments, he finally had a job, and not just any job. He was about to lead the greatest revolution in Chinese mythology. 70 years old, unemployed, and fishing with a straight hook. That was Jiang Ziya's life, until fate finally reeled something in. The Duke of Zhou, Ji Chang, had seen thousands of people in his lifetime, but something about this strange old man caught his attention. "Sir," Ji Chang said, "I believe you have great wisdom. Will you help me build a better world?" And just like that, Jiang Ziya, who had never held a military position in his life, suddenly became the chief strategist of an entire state. Problem was, Ji Chang's kingdom Zhou was tiny. It was just one of many vassal states under the Shang Dynasty, and the Shang king, Emperor Zhou, not related to the Zhou state, was a tyrant. He was rich, ruthless, and had an army of hundreds of thousands, while Zhou was a struggling underdog with barely enough soldiers to defend itself. Jiang Ziya took one look at the situation and rubbed his temples. Well, this is going to be tough. But after spending 40 years failing at everything, he wasn't about to let this be another disaster. So, he got to work. First, he strengthened Zhou's economy. More food, more trade, more wealth. Then he trained the army. Better discipline, better weapons, better tactics. And finally, he built alliances, secretly convincing other vassal states that the Shang Dynasty was on its way out. Years passed, and thanks to Jiang Ziya's planning, the tiny state of Zhou transformed into the most powerful force in China. Of course, Emperor Zhou eventually caught on. One day, Ji Chang was invited to the Shang capital as a guest, but in reality it was a trap. He was imprisoned for 7 years. Jiang Ziya was now completely in charge of Zhou, and that's when he decided it was time to go all in. He started launching small-scale raids, weakening Shang's forces, testing their weaknesses, and the moment Ji Chang was finally released, Zhou declared full-scale war against the Shang Dynasty. Jiang Ziya had just set the wheels of history in motion. The war for the fate of China had begun. It was a classic underdog story, a tiny kingdom taking on an empire. The Zhou army was outnumbered 10-1, but Jiang Ziya was playing a long game. He knew the Shang army was massive, but they weren't loyal. The empire had ruled with fear and cruelty for years, and people were secretly waiting for a chance to turn against it. So instead of fighting head-on, Jiang Ziya used deception, diplomacy, and strategic ambushes. His plan worked. More and more states defected from Shang. The emperor's army began to crumble from within. And then came the final battle, the Battle of Muye. Jiang Ziya led only 100,000 soldiers against Shang's 700,000-strong army. The odds? Absolutely horrible. But as Jiang Ziya had predicted, the Shang troops had no morale. When the battle started, many of them switched sides. Within hours, the once mighty Shang Dynasty collapsed. Defeated and humiliated, Emperor Zhou fled to his infamous pleasure palace, set everything on fire, and burned himself alive. The Shang Dynasty, which had ruled for nearly 600 years, was no more. And Jiang Ziya, the 70-year-old ex-fisherman, ex-cook, ex-failed immortal, had just led the greatest military victory in Chinese history. But his story wasn't over yet. Because now, the world of gods needed a new order. With the Shang Dynasty gone, the new Zhou Dynasty was established. Ji Chang's son, Ji Fa, became King Wu of Zhou, and China entered a new era. But Jiang Ziya wasn't celebrating yet, because the war had left the supernatural world in chaos. Many of the gods, spirits, and demons that had fought in the war had nowhere to go. Some had died in battle, some had lost their divine status, and some were too powerful to be left wandering the mortal realm. If nobody handled this mess, the balance between heaven and earth would collapse. And so, the gods gave Jiang Ziya one last task, to create the Fengshen List, a divine ranking system that would assign each spirit its rightful place in the new celestial order. And so, the former nobody took one final job, not as a fisherman, not as a military strategist, but as the ultimate administrator of the gods. He wrote down names, assigned divine roles, and literally reshaped the spiritual hierarchy of Chinese mythology. The greatest warriors became gods of war. The fallen heroes were immortalized in legend. The evil spirits were banished or sealed away forever. And when his work was done, Jiang Ziya did the most surprising thing of all. He retired. He didn't ask for power. He didn't want a divine title. He didn't even stay in the capital. Instead, he walked away from it all, returned to the quiet riverside, and went back to fishing. Someone once asked him, "Master Jiang, why did you choose to live like this after all you've done?" He just smiled. "A man's duty is like fishing," he said. "When the time is right, you cast your line. When the work is done, you let the river flow as it should." And so, the man who built a dynasty and organized the gods faded into legend as nothing more than an old fisherman by the river. Final thoughts. Jiang Ziya, the ultimate late bloomer. Jiang Ziya's story is one of the greatest comeback arcs in mythology. He failed for 40 years, only to rise to power at age 70. He went from a broke fisherman to the man who changed history. He didn't just defeat an empire, he reorganized heaven itself. And if his life teaches us anything, it's never too late to find your destiny. So if you're feeling lost, if you think your time has passed, just remember, even a 70-year-old fisherman can end up running the celestial bureaucracy. And that's the legend of Jiang Ziya.